All right, we're ready to fight the Germans now. We're going to use this new strategy I have. We've set our fallback lines so that the Germans have to face us in the forests and the swamps. I've got my divisions lined up. This is going to be epic. I'm just going to be so happy. But I need to check my production first. Let's just see what's going on with that. Production efficiency is a little low. I could get that up, but otherwise this production looks great. Let's do it. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Counterfactual Gaming, the gaming channel where if there's something historical in a game, we don't do it. And I'm here attacking Germany as Italy because, frankly, it would be really boring to just show footage of armored car production in the Soviet Union. Because today I want to talk about factory construction and factory output. But before we get started with that, I just want to tell everyone that if you like the content that you see here, or you think that my strategy for attacking Germany is really bad, put a like on the video, subscribe, put a comment down below, and ask me why the Italians are actually winning in the mountains, despite the fact that, we have terrible Italian divisions. And I'll be sure to have an answer for you. You may not like my answer, but I will have an answer for you. Although what I can't answer is why the Germans think that they are ever possibly going to retake this tile without the ability to pierce my terrible Italian divisions. So today I want to talk about military factory versus civilian factory construction. Okay, no, that's not really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about instead factory output as the Soviet Union. And when I'm talking about factory output as the Soviet Union, I'm not just talking about how to make these factories really good. Talking about how do we get the right amount of material produced in time for the war. Do we build civilian factories? Do we build military factories? Do we build a combination of them? What do we do? And a lot of players really like to focus on building civilian factories up to a certain point and then building their military factories. But the question is, when does it make sense to make that transition? And what are the trade-offs? Here's what I mean by trade-offs. We're looking right now at a save game I have in January of 1942. And you can see that I have X number of factories in play. I have my military factories just producing one piece of equipment so that we can measure it. You can see that I have certain techs and certain parts of the Soviet focus tree completed, giving me a certain production efficiency cap. But this total amount of equipment produced would be very different if I built fewer civilian factories, built more civilian factories, used different techs, did something different in the focus tree. But if we go take a look at my focus tree right now, you can see that I completed the center. I didn't do very much over here. I made damn sure I got all the relevant focuses over here, focused on foreign experts, did the free factory focuses that are all over the place over here, and grabbed the very specific tech boosts and industrial modernizations. But all of these decisions that I make, when do I build a military factory? When do I build a civilian factory? Come with trade-offs. The longer we build civilian factories, the less equipment we might have on hand when the war actually starts. Conversely, the more military factories I build, the fewer overall factories I might actually have access to when the war starts. If we're going to talk about building military factories, building civilian factories, and measuring that output, how do we do that? How do we measure all of those things? Well, we're going to do this in a couple of different ways, and this is going to be similar to how I measured Germany's output with different build schemes many months ago, but we're going to tailor it to the Soviets. Again, we look at the Soviet focus tree. How you play with the focus tree, what paths you pick, might radically change how many factories you have, how efficient those factories are, and so on. So the first thing is we're only building factories for this run. We're only building factories. Now, depending on which build scheme I'm doing, whether I do a pure military factory build or build civilians to 37, 38, or 39, we're only building factories. We will not be building infrastructure. We are not building synthetic plants. We're not building fuel silos, radar, nothing. We are just building factories. Now, I know a lot of players, they love their infrastructure building as the Soviets. And yeah, you do, in a real game, you should be building some infrastructure in some places. It's particularly useful to build infrastructure in a couple of key tiles that actually have both resources and lots of factory slots. I 100% agree with that. But I don't want this discussion to get bogged down in how much infrastructure do you build, where do you build it, oh, you didn't build it in the right place. We're not going to do any of that. We're just measuring raw factory output, so we're just going to build factories. We're also going to measure our factory output of war material in armored cars. Again, this is something I did when I measured Germany's output. And there are a couple of reasons we're using armored cars. One, the Soviets start with armored car tech. Two, it only costs 2 steel per factory. 3, the Soviets are not going to get armored cars from other countries. I will be absorbing the Baltic states, but they're not going to have any armored cars. And if you weren't sure about that, I can literally go over here and we see in the logistics tab, there's just BA-20s there. That's all we have. There's no contamination like there would be if I had infantry kits or like support equipment or something like that. Now, I had considered doing interwar light tanks using wheeled chassis and using only 1 steel, but I decided that for simplicity and consistency's sake, armored cars with their 4 production cost and 2 steel cost would give me the most consistent results. And there'd be less ways for me to mess up the tests by forgetting to cheat in the requisite XP or designs or whatever. It's easy to do armored cars. And in terms of focus order, I used almost the exact same focus order for all runs, with some exceptions that I'll discuss in just a moment, where I focused on pushing through the Stalin focuses, taking a break from Stalin focuses to do industry focuses over here, to grab the requisite techs, to grab the design company for industry, to grab the free factories, to grab the research slot, and also grabbing the requisite stuff for propaganda. We're doing positive heroism branch, and to grab the claims in the Baltic so I can eat the Baltic states. The exceptions to the focus order are that some of these focuses have factory count requirements. And in some runs, because civilian factories are more expensive than military factories, I had to modify focus order because we did not meet the requirements for certain focuses at certain times with certain builds. And I think this has an impact on 37 and 38 more than it does on the pure military factory build or the 39 build. I also don't do the propaganda campaigns until we get further along. But when I'm running the propaganda campaigns, we're doing improve the high yield and all that other stuff as much as I can. I appoint Kalinin for all runs as first minister pick because we could really use the stability. And for the civilian factory runs, I do appoint the civilian factory construction guy. And for purge events, I always block the purge for the civil service one because that slows down factory output. And I save the life of the civilian factory guy as long as he is still useful for building civilian factories. Once I'm done building civilian factories, he can be purged. It's not a big deal. Now, in my testing run, I'm doing 4 basic tests. I'm testing pure military factory construction from the beginning of the game. I'm testing civilians to 1937, civilian factories to 1938, and civilian factories to 1939. And we're going to take a look at factory counts, and we're going to take a look at armored cars produced, and we're going to see how they stack up against each other at both June of 1941 and January of 1942. Here we have the screenshot showing the results of the tests to 1941. And these results were both different than what I was expecting and different from the results I saw when I did similar tests with Germany. Of particular interest is that you'll notice that the pure military factory build doesn't even compare favorably with 37 and 38 in terms of raw armored car output, while also having inferior factory count. But what was most surprising to me was that 37 and 38 were so close to each other in terms of armored cars produced. So let's compare all this for just a second. The pure military build does produce more armored cars than all of the other builds, but the pure military build is just like 2,000 armored cars ahead of the 37 and the 38 builds. And 2,000 more armored cars when we're looking at hundreds of thousands of armored cars is like 1% more equipment, which barely matters in this situation. It has a significantly inferior factory count. You'll notice that both 37 and 38 have more factory. Where it gets weird is that 37 and 38 have almost identical armored car counts. And I had to rerun 37 and 38 multiple times because I really thought I'd screwed something up. And I didn't. It turns out that it kept happening over and over again. And I think I know why. It's because the 38 build doesn't open up certain focuses in the 5-year plan as fast as the 37 build does, because the 37 build meets the minimum factory count threshold faster because it's got more military factories built sooner. Yes, I know the 38 build has more overall military factories by June of 1941. But when I'm taking those focuses, there's fewer overall factories, and because military factories build faster, the 37 build can take certain focuses faster in the 5-year plan focus tree. This means they get certain bonuses into place faster than the 38 build does, and this helps them boost their armored car output. You'll notice that the 1939 civilian factories build severely underperforms in terms of armored cars. It's really low. The pure military factory build has almost 25% more armored cars produced than the 1939 build. Now, the 1939 build really excels in factories, and you'll notice that it has a lot more civilian factories than any of the previous builds. You may be wondering to yourself, how does it do that? How does it get so many more civilian factories than even the 38 build? And the reason here is because that extra year of building civilian factories is happening while the Soviets have much more advanced industry tech, and when they're consistently firing the high-yield propaganda campaign. This makes the 1939 build far more capable of capitalizing on civilian factory stacking while also exceeding the military factory counts of all the other builds. But the sacrifice here is that you're fighting with far less equipment in June of 1941. But what happens when we extend the timeline to June of 42? What changes? Well, the first thing that happens is that the 37 and 38 factory builds begin to exceed the pure military build in actual armored car output. But again, you will notice that the difference here is still relatively small. That pure military factory build is still fairly competitive in terms of equipment produced by June of 42. That 1939 civilian factory build is still about 15% weaker in terms of armored car output compared to 38 and 37. But again, it's way ahead in terms of factories, extending its lead in terms of factory count significantly. Not just civilian factories, but it is coming out significantly ahead in military factory count as well. Then I started to think for a second. I was like, this test is a little bit flawed. Not that the methodology is bad so much as I'm leaving something out. I'm leaving out an old strategy we used to use in some of our multiplayer games that, as it turns out, is also used in the French Hearts of Iron community. What if we instead converted military factories to civilian factories from the start? After all, it's much cheaper to convert factories than it is to build factories. If you're not sure, take a look at the tooltip. It costs $7,200 to build a military factory. It only costs $4,000 to convert a factory over. It costs $10,000 to build a new civilian factory, but it only costs $9,000 to convert a factory over. Now, these are, of course, modified by infrastructure as well. And so I decided to do a test for that. Now, I'm not going to build any infrastructure, and the way most people would do this kind of build scheme is they build some infrastructure in a couple of key states, then convert all the military factories in those key states to civilian factories after engaging in war economy. But since I'm not building any infrastructure in my states, just to keep the test purely about factory output, I need to do a slightly different take on this. So what I did is I went through and set up a build scheme where I was going to build civilian factories in 1939. But once we have war economy from the Spanish Civil War, we pause the construction of civilian factories, and I go to Leningrad and convert all of those factories to civilian factories, and I go to Moscow and convert these factories to civilian factories, and then resume construction of civilian factories to 1939. Now, Leningrad and Moscow both have 4 out of 5 infrastructure levels. So even if I was going to do an infrastructure building part of this, I would only be building one infrastructure in each place. But again, the point here is just to measure factory output, not to dither around with how much infrastructure the Soviets need to build. Well, if we look at our handy-dandy Canva pre-generated banner here, we can see that converting factories over results in only 210,000 armored cars by June of 41, but generates a whole lot more civilian factories at 158 owned civilian factories by June of 1941, alongside 238 military factories, just like the 1939 build with no factory conversion has. And so, despite the lower armored car count, and it is a significant reduction in armored car numbers, converting the factories over, it does not diminish overall military factory count by June of 41, but it does result in an increase in civilian factories. So if we seem to have a similar military factory count by the time June of 41 rolls around, how does this change the way we look at military factory construction versus civilian factory construction? Well, if we do the conversion of the factories in Leningrad and Moscow, we end up with 395 total factories in June of 41 and 448 factories by January of 42. This is a clear win in terms of overall factory counts. There's no mistaking it. This is also what we would expect. But it is much weaker in terms of equipment produced. You only get 210,000 armored cars by June of 41 and only 335,000 armored cars by January of 42. If you convert those military factories over, you are still behind in terms of raw equipment produced, even if your military factory count is higher. It's worth pointing out that by January 42, the gap is narrowing, but you have not reached the same amount of equipment produced if you had just done the 1938 build. So where does all of that leave us in terms of factories for the Soviet Union? Well, I'll boil it down to a couple of major points. One, the differences in output between 37 and 38 builds really are the result of focus orders. You don't open up certain focuses in a certain order due to building more expensive civilian factories than military factories in the 38 build. But looking at the numbers, the 38 build is better than the 37 build in most ways. Two, there is no reason to build only military factories from the start unless you intend to fight Germany in 39. The 1939 civilian build does not catch up to the 38 build even by January of 42. We should be cautious in overbuilding civilian factories as the Soviets. It's real easy to get into a Victoria 3 mindset and say, hey, I want to have lots of factories, but you actually do want equipment for the war. Number 4, the conversion of military factories to civilian factories is potent for factory count, but really nerfs your production. But wait, what about multiplayer? In multiplayer, compounding civilian factory growth from the Allies buying Soviet stuff with converting factories will yield even higher factory counts. This is why some folks in the French Hearts of Iron multiplayer community choose this strategy for the Soviets. Is they're not just converting the factories over, they're not just building some infrastructure and then converting factories over. They're specifically factoring in the fact that Britain, the US, and other countries are going to be buying from the Soviets with the Soviets under war economy. Single player, the AI is not a reliable trading partner, so you're not going to get as much mileage out of it. Basically, you can snowball harder in multiplayer in this particular way. Now, despite the advantages to delaying military factory construction, I do want everyone to keep in mind that there are plenty of equipment types that the Soviets need and can build from 36 and 37. We're talking Tier 1 infantry kits, support equipment, 34 heavy tanks for Space Marines, BT-7s for light tanks. You have plenty of options for equipment that you can just build from the very beginning. Don't think that the only good equipment to build comes after research by 38. There are other things to build. Let's keep in mind also that the Soviet buffs to production efficiency cap and tech boosts favor putting things into production, just letting production lines run forever. This is why the Soviet build looks different than the German build I did several videos ago. The Germans don't end up with as much production efficiency cap, so the Soviets get more mileage from the 38 build and the 37 build than Germany does, because those factories just keep building production efficiency more and more and more than they possibly could under German rule. And finally, why am I not advocating any of these approaches as a meta? Well, because the answer is that when you play in single player, you have to ask when you want the Soviets to peak. Are the extra factories worth it if you don't have the equipment to meet the Axis right now? Are they worth it if you can occupy Germany before they come online? These are questions I can't answer for you. These are questions only you as the player can answer. So I'm not saying 38 is the absolute meta build. I'm not saying the 39 version is the meta build. I'm not saying converting factories is the meta build. I'm saying you have to ask when you want your production to peak. And that wraps up our video today. I want to thank you for watching. And I wanted to thank my channel members for making this channel possible. I was going to start listing channel members in the credits, but as you can see that when I polled them, they voted 100% to wait until I have more members to put in the credits. So, not going to list people in credits today. We'll wait until we've got some more members, and then we'll try that again in a different video. It's cloudy and windy for us today, and I hope you all have a pleasant day.